Did you know that there were no plans for dragons in Dragon Age, why the Mako is so strange to manipulate, and how the Asari came to be in Mass Effect? Hello, welcome to Tales Under the Cat Tree. I'm your host, Dupes. Each week, I pair a compelling piece of fiction or autobiography with bigger topics. Words create the worlds we live in, and stories provide a lens into understanding history, technology, or business by connecting personal narratives to the wider picture. Subscribe at tales.dupes.ca for more original writing and engaging interviews. Today on Tales Under the Cat Tree, I have ex-BioWare designers Georg and Emmanuel Lusinki. They are two of the most accomplished veterans of the modern gaming industry. I was lucky to catch up with them on a recent visit to Singapore where they both live. We talked a lot about the strange things and their most favorite accomplishments, as well as what they were seeing in the games industry today with the advent of AI. In the interview, we talk about the strange paths we all took to get to BioWare. In my case, I have been a role-playing gamer and especially a lover of D&D computer games since the mid-1980s. As such, I was part of the early community on the Usenet newsgroup comp.sys.ibm.pc.games.rpg. When BioWare was releasing Baldur's Gate 1, Ray Muzica, one of the CEOs, was doing much of the community work, and I interacted a couple of times and followed the discussion on things like, would they even implement Fireball correctly? In 1998, after the game came out, as a nascent web designer in those days living in St. John's, Newfoundland in Canada, I decided to apply to a graphic arts position they had. So I cobbled together some terribly drawn dragons and sent in my application. Thankfully, for everyone's sake, I did not get that position. This was the position that Todd Grenier, an amazing artist whom I would later work with, would get. But the rejection I got made me want to try even harder and do whatever I could do to apply. Greg Zeschuk, the other CEO, responded kindly to my first application that A, I was too far away in St. John's. They could only really afford to hire near Alberta, Canada. And B, it didn't look like I had the skills for the position. But he added a postscript. I have to say, you have a really cool name. When the time came, I moved provinces to British Columbia so I could get closer, learned web programming, and played more BioWare games. In 2001, I applied again, and this time I flew in for an interview that many ex-BioWareans still mock me about because, remembering what my mother said about being well-dressed for an interview, I arrived in a full black suit. This time, though, Mark Klutschke, who ran HR at the time, told me I was overqualified for the position, but they would keep my application on file. Mark and the team were true to their word, and later, in 2001, they asked me to come work for BioWare. In those days, you could say I had a very persistent, one-track personality. I had no doubt in my mind that one day I would work for BioWare. And like for most of us who joined back then, the fact that Ray and Greg took a chance on us changed the trajectory of our entire lives. Now, let's talk to Georg and Emmanuel Lusinki about how the Asari came to be, dragons in Dragon Age, manipulating the Mako, and the changes they have seen in the games industry. Today's episode covers Neverwinter Nights, Jade Empire, Mass Effect, Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic, and the massively multiplayer Star Wars The Old Republic. Let's get going.
Georg, I used to be a designer, I guess. I started as a systems designer on Neverwinter Nights, Sword of the Underdark, like Emmanuel, recruited out of the community. At the time, was lead systems designer for Jade Empire afterwards. Worked a little bit on Jade Empire 2, which I guess we can talk about because it's cancelled. Mass Effect. I had my fingers in the infamous Mako vehicle at the time and the exploding barrel, which are really people that we explode. Dragon Age Origins, where I was lead combat designer, I think, something like that, or lead technical designer. And then Star Wars The Old Republic, where I was principal lead combat designer. And I think I just always did the same thing, which is technical systems, building data-driven solutions like analytics and understanding of what we're actually doing, trying to take the magic out of the BioWare magic, less trust in it's going to work out, more trust in data. And yeah, it was a good time.
Oh, okay. I'm Emmanuel. I started at BioWare about a month or a few weeks after Georg. Also, as you mentioned, it recruited from the community on Neverwinter Night. I was hired specifically to work on a new project, which was called Chronicles, and that eventually became Dragon Age, which was BioWare kind of life after the D&D license and trying to find a publisher. So we had to make a nice demo. I worked on that for a while, and then I was moved to the Jade Empire team, and I worked with Georg there directly. It was on my birthday back then, which was a Saturday and Sunday. We decided to rewrite chapter 1 and chapter 2 because they were absolutely awful in terms of scripting. So we spent the entire weekend redoing that.
I have a picture somewhere with him collapsing under my desk somewhere. We rebuilt the entire first 4 hours of the game in one night.
It was funny because when we to do some crunch time on Jade Empire, they were announcing, sorry, we have to work until 10 p.m. every day and on Saturday as well. And Georg and I were thinking, wait, it's a lot less hours we are putting in right now. So awesome. Anyway, after Jade Empire, I went back to Dragon Age. And I was, all-purpose designers on it. I wrote all the mage stories, the mage origin, and so on.
You did the multiplayer that never
I
showed.
was lead multiplayer, which is funny because Dragon Age doesn't have multiplayer, but that was a feature we cut. We did design things like a multiplayer conversation system, which we reused in the Old Republic. So not everything was lost. After that, I was sent to Austin, Texas with 2 other people, James Holland and Daniel Erickson, to start the BioWare Austin studio to work on a massively multiplayer game. At the time, we didn't know what was the IP. So we worked on several IP at the same time, trying to find publisher for it. So I developed really plans for Game of Thrones, massively multiplayer game, for Dungeons and Dragons, massively multiplayer game, and for Harry Potter, but that nobody wanted to do that. So it was just me. So that was cut straight away. And indeed for the Star Wars massively multiplayer games, which is the one that ended up having traction.
And this became Star Wars, the Old Republic.
That's right.
So fun fact, both shared the same office from the start in 2003 with Brent Knowles and Duron Jacobs.
Yeah.
And I have worked with him at every company I worked at since then in the last 23 years.
By the way, we went to Ubisoft Singapore, and after Ubisoft Singapore, we went to Meta, and after Meta, we went to various startups. Anyway, so yeah, it has been 20 odd years.
23 years, yeah.
23 years. So on the Old Republic, I was at the time associate lead designer. We did not have a designer, it was just me. I did some of the combat initially, then Georg, I convinced Georg to come and work for us in Austin, Texas by talking to his wife and mentioning, in the middle of winter, mentioning how hot and nice it was. So that worked.
I should have gotten suspicious when the orange juice on the plane to BioWare's interview in 2003 was frozen in May. No, not May, March. And later it became clear to me the company was hiring in Europe because no one in North America was stupid enough to move to Edmonton.
My interview was on the 1st of May and it was snowing. So yes, BioWare, Edmonton. Anyway, so on the Old Republic, I ended up after a while becoming for 1 week the lead designer and then technical design director. Anyway, what else to say? I did have a little bit to do with Mass Effect. So what happened is when I was working on Dragon Age, again, creative director James was asking, guys, give us ideas about nations, organizations, whatever, let's build up the world. And I wrote a few that ended up becoming part of the IP. And so James was really impressed for some reason with what I wrote on the various Night of Volley and Arden and all those things. And so when it came time to do the same thing on Mass Effect, it was a new project to say, I don't have time. Do you mind doing it? So I sat down with the writers of Mass Effect, pushed a number of ideas. Some of them were just basic ideas, okay, what we should do is go against stereotype for aliens. So, for example, maybe almost noble race should be based on cockroach. Maybe almost dangerous and vicious, race should be based on something fairly harmless like turtle. And they were just really happy with all the suggestions. So I was wondering what I could get away with. And so finally I told them, what we really need in this game is a space lesbian. Let me explain. This is a very simple thing. In classic science fiction, Captain Kirk's get to bang all the aliens, which make no sense. There's why would aliens find the human male attractive? But if we have a race of space lesbians that are only females and they do sleep with other aliens in a way to get DNA and then they mix it and that's how they reproduce and it will make sense and they get attracted to the captain. It was a joke. I was like really seeing, and they're like, "This is a brilliant idea." So it went into the game. That's my claim of fame for Mass Effect. I was not responsible for the Mako. That's all him.
The Mako is an interesting one. Right? We were working with an unfinished Unreal Engine, right? And I think a lot of laundry has been aired on that topic in the years after, where some companies failed because the engine wasn't ready. Other companies got hundreds of Microsoft engineers flown in.
This was Unreal 3.
I think it was Unreal 3 at the time, right? And it was all new stack. It had a whole bunch of new things, visual scripting, all of that, none of which worked very well with BioWare. I had built the plot management tool, like basically a state machine manager being usable by writers to manage the complexity of plots. Fun fact is we didn't have that in Star Wars. In Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic, you manage plot by putting random variables on objects in the world. And there was one world where the designer, Peter Thomas, who had taken care of that world, had stored all the plot state on a wandering animal. And, he's like, okay, I'll make the animal can't be targeted, so you can't, kill it. We store the plot state there. Well, it turned out that grenades didn't target, right? They would just kill the animals in the blast radius, and with it, all the knowledge and state of the plot. So there were very obscure errors after KOTOR shipped about people not being able to finish the game. And one of the lessons of that was we need like proper data infrastructure to keep track of all the complex choices you make in a BioWare game. So I built that for Mass Effect, but it was all unfinished. Like these had been tools we write ourselves to integrate in an engine that was barely finished. And we were very excited because Unreal 3 came with vehicles. There were a bunch of vehicles in there, hovercrafts, glide tanks, really cool vehicles. And so we had prototype, we were all really excited. And then at some point, the artist showed us their design for the vehicle, which was a dump truck, some Soviet Special Forces vehicle, 16 wheels, and none of it would work with any of the fun existing physics models that were in Unreal. But the art vision was supreme. So we had to make it work. And even up to weeks before shipping, when I had already shifted off the project to Mass Effect, people managed to flip the damn tank because we had to build our own physics system and everything for it. So at some point, the team just decided, all right, let's put the center of gravity of this thing 50 meters under the ground. It solved the problem. You cannot flip this vehicle anymore. But it also makes for incredibly wonky physics that, your brain really rejects as this is not right. It was an interesting aspect of BioWare. I think every project's DNA was basically the founding team. And on Mass Effect, it was incredibly art-driven. The art was supreme, right? Dragon Age in many ways was the counter, especially after, I joined from Mass Effect onto Dragon Age. I drove the counter. I was really frustrated with that. I'm like, I know you want God of War, but we're also selling our audience nostalgia. We're selling them the next Baldur's Gate. That was a lot. And at some point, you're going to have to make choices, right? So I was quite dictatorial and aggressive around gameplay. Right. And you see that reflected in the prioritization and in the way these games play out, right? Like Dragon Age, heavy gameplay focus, many options in gameplay, way more than Jade Empire, for example, right? Which was yet another focus. And the trade-offs main, like the fidelity of the animations, gameplay over animation and so on. And this is the games industry in the end. It's the making these trade-offs and hoping that you're hitting the right audience that appreciates those trade-offs, because you can't have it all unless, I guess, you're Red Dead Redemption, then you really can't have it all. But beyond that, you're constantly fighting for the soul between these different parties of who are involved, because everyone wants to do what is in their vision, right? And depending on how strong the lead designer is, how strong the creative director, the project director is, and where he allocates the power, you get the outcome.
One of the hard decisions that came very early in Dragon Age design was that when you kill things, it would splatter of blood, and it cannot be almost permanent on your character until you kill it up. That stayed on. But another one, like James, didn't like longer creatures, because when they turn around, especially in a game that is grid-based, all kind of weird things happen. It doesn't push characters. So we're like, guys, let's just
PTSD.
Let's avoid issues. We won't have dragons. And like everybody signed up, no dragons, no long creatures, no snakes, nothing. Now you have to understand that later on we need to choose a name for the project, because right now it was called Chronicles, which was a code name. Like Mass Effect was SFX, all those things. So Chronicle needed a real names. And in BioWare, they found out that it's impossible to find a name for a project. Impossible. Every name that you find that is cool will be taken by an obscure games, by an obscure thing. So what they did for Jade Empire and Mass Effect and Dragon Age, they put together a list of words that are kind of related to the game you want to make. There's a just random algorithm that puts those words together, and it prints out a giant list of things. And then, designers are given that big things being printed out, and you take a pen and you're like, that's stupid. Oh, this is not completely stupid. And you go on through the list. And it takes a few hours, but in the end, you don't have that many names that are okay. And in Dragon Age, in the end, the 10 remaining names, you give it to your research department, and they're going to find out which is free and so on. And Dragon Age find out there was just one old games in the 80s or something like this that was non-defunct. And it was the only name we could take. And everybody like, Dragon Age, there's a Iron Age and there's Dragon. It makes sense. Let's use it. And I'm like, oh, boss,
we don't have dragons.
Remember that discussion you said, no dragons? Like, oh, shit. So, wait. We do have an archdemon. Any reason the archdemon couldn't be a dragon? Like, no particular reason. So there you go. No, he has a dragon.
There's a little bit of additional trauma there, which is one of the serious problems that the industry always has is game engines. Game engines are hard, really hard. When you look at the most successful games at BioWare, where Baldur's Gate 2 was successful because you didn't have to solve the engine problem. You just expanded on top of an incredibly powerful engine, right? That made Baldur's Gate into expansion packs and whatnot. And then there was a team setting off, and I think under Trent, right, to build engine technology. And I remember there was a time when they demoed it, and the demo was a shooter. It was a World War I shooter. And we were all like, okay. Okay, first person, right? Like everything about BioWare game is, right? And so there was a lot of work basically reconciling the technical work. And like one of the lessons I think everyone learns in this industry at some point is you don't ship anything where you don't have a client project that defines the direction where you're going, right? You're at risk of building things that don't really fit very well, right? Like first person and so on. And like in the end, this worked out okay. I think there was a lot of pieces of the old Aurora engine still in there, the scripting language and so on, just beefed up with our learnings, which helped us, right? Fun fact as well, Aurora was the engine given to CD Projekt Red to do The Witcher. So the Witcher franchise started on the Neverwinter engine. Then you understand like challenges around why do you avoid long creatures and so on. It is because of that DNA and because of those lessons that you've learned. So when you undo those changes, then you have to pay down the road significantly, right? And the problem is you need to amortize those engines over many games, right? EA at the time when we got brought into EA had also built their own engine, Frostbite. And the early versions of their engine couldn't handle slopes because NFL games don't need slopes, right? All fun challenges. And it's a bit ironic because when you look at the industry, right, there's a few standard engines left, Unreal, Unity, Godot, I guess, but that's really more indie, but that's really it. And a lot of custom handmade engines. And I work with Anvil at Ubisoft. The code base is it's rivaling the Facebook code base in terms of size. Every problem solved in its own way, and so on, because it's the only way you can stay somewhat independent. There's always the risk someone might buy Epic or buy Unity and then own the entire game industry and have all the power over it. But the cost of it is part of the reason why the industry is in so much trouble now. We've designed ourselves into a corner. Like, we created the AAA segment by making it ridiculously expensive to make games. And now the growth isn't there anymore. You can't raise funds to make these games anymore. So many other reasons why we're in a mess right now, but this is one of them.
On the little tidbits of knowledge, you were mentioning the rabbits where all the global variable were saved. There's just something a little bit similar on the Old Republic. It turned out that our effect system, everything from spells to anything, could not target non-creature. You would think that's something that would be very important to fix, but priority being priority. So the world design team, which wanted to have explosion during cutscene, all those things, so they needed to play something and here an effect would be played. What they did, they took a humanoid creature and they shrunk it down until it was 1 pixel big. Little green men, they had a green texture, and they would put them everywhere. And then during the cutscene, they would just target this guy and just blow him up and so on. And so you can imagine, because those guys had full animation network, they weird bug in cutscene, like the explosion is not what it is, or it's following you and this thing. And I think, Georg, you're the one who found out that they did all that thing, or somebody did.
Yeah, I did a lot of work with analytics at the time, right? Like, I basically deconstructed the terrible engine we were using, Hero engine, that was never used ever again in anything, I think. And I basically deconstructed it completely, started reading the data files, building a copy in a database of what the game is, and started querying it and then rendering it out as, maps. And I'm like, why is there tens of thousands of creatures on this planet that would perfectly explain why the performance is so bad, right? And jump to the location in the engine architect. There's no one here. What is happening, right? Are they under the floor? Are they somewhere in the sky? And eventually it emerged that every single barrel, every single object that can explode, every crate you could hit, it was a creature, because design was so conditioned to not ask engineering for new features because they were so far behind anyway, that they just solved all these things on their own. It's a key skill for a designer. You work with what you have. Yeah. Right? But it's at scale, it becomes terrible. And ironically, we've seen this pattern in most games. Mass Effect's exploding barrels were also creatures. But we had the good grace of not using transparency, but a null body that didn't have animation and so on.
So what else did you do that was funny? Few things. So for example, at the beginning, we wanted a group of 4 people and everybody has a companion, so that 8 people. That made it really difficult to actually create content, because between 2 people and 8 people, there's quite a big difference in power.
This is in the
Old Republic, yes. But more importantly, the world builder had to build everything to scale so that the corridors and everything could fit 8 people comfortably. Eventually, I changed the design so that, which is a simple system, it's 4 people maximum. And when you join a group, it just kicks your companion out, and it's a simple system. But another thing that happened is, from the beginning, we said we would have mods like every MMO. But we also decided that having bikes and cars and things would look stupid, because they could not go that fast. If you go more than 2 or 3 times faster than a running person, everything break into the game. The triggers don't trigger when you cross them. Monsters, you can hit them and they can't chase you and all those things. So we decided we would have mounts that are creatures like Tauntaun and Giant Lizard and all those things. It's very Star Wars. And very late into the project, when all the planet had been designed and shipped, and delivered, the engineering department was like, yeah, we can't do mount. We don't have the time. Sorry, it's just too complicated. 2 animation network. Can't do it. Sorry, bye-bye. So for a while, we had to deal with giant planets, which were a pain to cross because you just didn't go as fast as possible. And
we brought the speeder bikes, but the engine's ability to stream information was very limited. So they could only go about 25% faster than walking speed.
Well, it's actually twice as fast as a running, but it's not that much when you think about it. But the thing we had never tested whether it would look stupid or not to have a speeder bike going only twice as fast as a running person. So I tested it. I created, we had the assets. So those bikes were parked everywhere in the street, took those assets, and I just paralyzed the guys and put him inside and just was running around and actually coded the entire speeder bike system. It didn't look stupid. It looked pretty good. Changed the FOV so that you look like you're going faster and all those things. But for a while, when you join the game as a developer, you first go to a world where there's all the doors to all the world so that you can just very quickly jump around. And so everybody that joins the game goes into that lobby. And in the lobby, I was here on my speeder bike, like hanging out, going around and so on. And this feature doesn't exist in the game whatsoever. So people were like, how is that guy doing this? And I want one. So it was a very...
which ironically is exactly why you and I were hyped, right? When you look at it, and I think this was part of BioWare's, the heydays of BioWare and how the company managed to grow, is we both were hired out of the community. I had a website where I made little objects you could put into your worlds, right? Little creatures that had AI, and you would just slot them in and they would work in your Neverwinter module. And you had to submit a resume and Neverwinter module to get an interview at BioWare. And Rob Bartel, who was, I think, one of the key designers on Neverwinter Nights, reached out to us because he found our stuff on the internet, this being one of the first games with real, organized user-created content, and said, hey, I want to use your stuff. We have this idea of building like an anthology of the best user-created content and modules, what later became the premium modules, and one of the first cases of DLC, user-created DLC in the history of the gaming industry. When he put together his Witch's Wake module, he took stuff from us. And, that went out. And then he said, well, you should send us a module. You should apply for a job. And I didn't really take that seriously. I mean, I was in Germany in university at the time. It was just after the .com crash. I was bored. I was like, yeah, sure, why not, right? Like, what could be the harm? So I submitted a module. He submitted a module. Jaron Jacobs, Brad Prince, everyone who worked there submitted a module. And Brent Knowles, the lead designer, his job was like to review those, right? And a lot of these, I later found like the folder on the shared BioWare drive where all these submissions were. The thing that was in common was always like he couldn't figure out how we did it. Like, I remember his module still. Like, he had a creature, a dragon, I think, made purely out of visual effects, beam visual effects, like a complex matrix transformation moving across the screen, right? Just math and visual effects. I had taken tiles, like objects and background tiles from the Neverwinter tile set, and had copied them into the visual effects system. So I had turned basically a bench and things into a visual effect. And then what that gives you is you can apply the visual effect, and here's your building. And then you take it away, and there's the destroyed building underneath. Doing these kind of sleight of hands, using the technology in ways that it totally wasn't meant to be used. Right? It was horrifying to engineer every single time we did that. But at the same time, that is how you made these games, and how, a game that never anticipated speeder bikes, a game that actually didn't have flying spaceships. Right?
Oh, yeah.
Like the Old Republic was you click on a button and then you jump to the next planet, and we'll tell you a little cutscene how you got there.
So that got me upset because the whole design was you're going to go from one planet to another in a completely seamless way. You're going to go into the ship, and that ship the whole world will be removed from memory, and the new one will be loaded, and then you come out. Your job is to be very flexible and say yes, but this was killing the game because it removes the fantasy of having a connected universe, and it was such a cheap way to do it. So my boss said, hey, can you fix it? Like, sure, as a designer, I'm going to fix it. So using VFX, I found the planets. We had some models. It's not difficult to make stars. So I did these things with a star field, and the planet, I just move it really close to your camera so that it looked like the typical Star Wars effect of jumping out of hyperspace and so on. And it worked. It kind of sold it a little bit better. Anyway, so that was a cool hack. Another one was, at the time, we had all the companion that just one appearance, and that was a canon appearance. So there was Twi'lek called Vet, which was companion of the warrior, Sith warrior. And she's blue, and she has a very specific face, and that's it. She's a canonic vet. And one of the writers were really concerned that the game did not have a standard face. We don't have characters we can show because your characters, of course, you
Kind of needed for PR.
For PR, we did not have the standard shepherd or standard of those things for Mass Effect. So I hacked the game engine to be able to equip items that would change the appearance of your companions. And it's funny because both for the spider back, the mount, for this and for the multiplayer hologram, I'll talk about it later, my boss threatened to fire me if I ever worked on it. It's like, these are good ideas, but we don't have the programming resources. You can't work on it. If you talk to a programmer, I'll fire you. Like, yes. And then I work on it by myself and demonstrated the value. So we did that. And there was a show, I think it was an E3 show, where the 3 big features we showed was the companion's variable appearance, the bytes, and the other one was a holographic multiplayer conversation. And all 3 things I developed over many weekends and under threat of being fired. But all the features that I plan that you cut down to the minimum, that's what make a game. But what make a good game is a feature you didn't plan for because you don't have time and they are a little bit too weird. And so you need people in your company that are able to develop features to a point where you can demonstrate them. On paper, it looks good, but nobody believes it until you can play it. And it's really important to have those guys that can hack the game engine, that have basic ability to create visual effect and so on and so forth, and demonstrate the value. Building functional prototypes. And when people can play, they're like, oh yeah, that's worth putting engineering time to it.
So would you say like one of the things about BioWare was the ability to get together, as you said, a number of people who believed in the idea of hacking things together, whether it was using software in ways that you couldn't do it, whether it was using game engines in ways that you couldn't do it, and then creating an environment that those people could thrive in?
My take over many, many years building teams, right, at Facebook, Ubisoft and other places and so on. What made BioWare special, the founders and the values, first and foremost, and there's really nothing negative I could ever say about like Ray, Greg. It was just working with people who are principled and setting the right values. And I have ample of comparison later. We even have the comparison with, let's say, how Pandemic, our sister studio that got bought up with BioWare, people were treated and all of this. That, I think, was probably the key ingredient, period. The other ingredient, people overall. I think it helped tremendously that there was a shared experience that everyone shared, even, the dude coming from Germany, from France, from all these other places, an incredibly international company. We all played Dungeons and Dragons at the time. That was the unifying thing, right? And that got replaced initially over time with people we hired played BioWare games. You had to be able to play games. And I think the testing method was incredibly good for hiring the modules, because it really proved your ability to work with what is there. And we had to impress people who made that damn engine to get the job. Phenomenal filter, right? The last piece, I think, is Edmonton. I hate to say it, right? There's many things that speak against Edmonton or Alberta, but Edmonton, I think, was a key ingredient in there because we later worked in Austin, which is kind of the birthplace of the American game industry, right? Richard Garriott, Origin, all of that. But I had interesting experiences. I was interviewing, I got an offer to work at Epic 2012. They were like, you were lucky. If you had stayed one more year in Austin, we wouldn't even have talked to you, because that place just recycles people and it is stale and it brings no ideas. So what Edmonton had is there was no other game company, not really. So all the talent came actually not from it. There was no schools that taught gaming at the time. It didn't exist yet. Right. So what? Brent ran a grocery store before. James ran a comic book shop before. I was, a random software engineering student database guy from Germany. He came from France, and I think you were in the US at the time.
I was in San Diego, yes. An engineer in microelectronics.
Right. All of us brought specific things from our experience in there that made for better games. There were no conventions. There was no way this is how you make games. I brought all my experience from database engineering and working in banks, game analytics. We pioneered some of the most advanced game analytics systems at BioWare and Electronic Arts, because we came out with financial background, and everyone had different experiences. And I think that was the diversity. I think it is truly the number one reason why this all worked, is because the people were incredibly diverse, but they had some things like the Dungeons and Dragons enthusiasm and so on that created a common bond. And that combination, I think, worked really wonders. And what you get is problem solvers, because you don't have that experience of having made many games before. You have to solve these problems. You have to forcefully look at it from a different perspective.
Would you also say that, like you said, you wanted to delight the people, you didn't want to have a game where you couldn't fly, right? Or you didn't have maths, or whatever the case may be, because we played the games, we were part of the games, we wanted the people who...
Yeah, we knew the player, right? This became harder over time, right? Because as you get bored, as your targets change, going to console was really painful. Sage Empire was an incredibly painful project for us because most of us were not console people and the Xbox was kind of shit. We were not excited because the limitations that created is like, aren't games supposed to be better? Why do I have a third of the memory available? And then you have to fight. Like, actually, you don't. You have only 1/8 because the graphics guys need all of it.
You covered it. The fact we had some stuff in common, regardless of where we came from. But and so you don't go to Edmonton if you're not really, really motivated. Like,
okay, I was just naive. I didn't know Edmonton was
cool.
But
sure, but you realize really quickly again, it was snowing on the 1st of May, but like the motivation, right? Everybody was there to do games because they like games.
Didn't feel like work. And I know that, there's a lot of exploitation in the game industry. And I think the project where I felt it started feeling exploitative was definitely Mass Effect. Because at that point we were larger, there was more corporate influence, but before that, it didn't feel like work. Mm. And honestly, Edmonton, like, it's -40 outside. What are you going to do? Like, I'd rather hang out with my friends, geek out about Dungeons and Dragons and make a cool game. It doesn't, like, at that point, there was no sense of like it feeling exploitative at all. Like, we had a really good time. I would look at it as still as the best time I ever had on any company I ever worked for. And I have, the pleasure of working in many very successful companies. Yeah. It was very special. It just felt right on like, you like the people. I mean, we were hanging out outside of work just as much as, it helps that, the world is a frozen ice planet outside. I'm not going to lie about that.
Well, look at it this way. We're here 20 odd years later having a conversation about it in Singapore. I mean,
yeah, we overcompensated. We went into Texas and, the first thing that happened when I had my car shipped from Canada is the tires melted on the road as I drove off the truck. Yeah. And I'm like, okay, different thing, different problems, right?
But I don't think I worked a single day at BioWare. It was just fun and strangely being paid for it. So.
Solving problems. There's a few other things I think that play a huge role, right? Like, that was still the time when you made games, so people would enjoy them, so they would buy the sequel, right? The Old Republic, of course, being a service game, being different. But before that, you made games and you wanted to do right. And it was always a gamble. Like, do we still have the touch? Do we know what people want? Can we make it together? And the end of game development processes is an incredibly painful process because you tend to cut 2/3 of the game. Neverwinter Nights, Hordes of the Underdark had an entire city of Waterdeep, that famous place from Dungeons and Dragons that had been built, scripted, and couldn't be shipped and finished. And had to be cut. So you're absolutely convinced the day you ship that this is going to be a shit show. Because in your mind, you have seen the game that you wanted to create, not the game you made, right? So you always have that weird experience that you go with the lowest expectations because you just see all the losses. And then people are like, wow, I really love this, right? Like, Hordes of the Underdark feeling like, wow, this is like, this feels like Neverwinter Nights is finally complete and so on. And that's, compensated for that. Today, the problem is that the business model, of course, is entirely different. You have to amortize over multiple games. You have to have DLC. You have to have all these things. And
unless you're Baldur's Gate 3.
Which is a good topic to go into, right? And like, huge credits to the guys at Larian. I absolutely love it. Everything they've done. I think, when you look at the challenge the industry has right now, we lost 20 to 25% of the industry's talent, probably for good, in the last 3 years. It's a complete disaster out there because games cannot be funded. Games compete against themselves. The games we made 10 years ago still look good. Red Dead Redemption, 7 years ago, looks still like the best game ever. And these games were not made under the monetary pressure of more microtransactions. And they're all still available for $10. So now 60% of the games sold are games older than 5 years. The industry is literally competing with its own supply and cannot beat it in quality because you cannot get the funding to do it. And if you get the funding, you need to extract enough money, which means, again, microtransaction, things that do destroy the purity of the design. You have to, like when you look at mobile, you have to make games frustrating so people to pay. So we're looking at an industry, and I hope this isn't like rose-tilted nostalgia, but when I look at it, we're looking at an industry that is competing against a shadow of itself, which currently is in a state of burning down because we cannot pay our talent anymore. The people with all the knowledge of how to do these things are churning out. And it is unclear, especially with all the, anticipation about AI. There isn't real use of AI yet in production. In some cases there is, but it's a really tough topic and things are changing too quickly. It is not clear how things will go. So no one is funding. So we're going into a bit of a winter here, right? And when I see things like Baldur's Gate 3, right, they are like shining beacons in there where you see, you can still do that. You can still make games and you can feel that the people who made them loved what they did. My career started on Neverwinter Nights in the game industry. 15 of us, I think, on that expansion pack. When I left Ubisoft, the last project that I had been on had 1,500 people in 7 countries and 12 studios working for 2.5 years on a tight schedule. Completely different. The level of ownership you have is down to the eyeball texture it just shows, right? It is really, really hard to make these kind of games. So yeah, when Baldur's Gate 3 came out, and like Cyberpunk as well, I would give it that.
Yeah, when we started, there were only 2 kind of designers, the writers and the other designers that did everything from world building to encounter design to sometimes some of the writings that would get retouched by a writer. By the time of the Old Republic, we had world designers, we had encounter designers, combat designers, cinematic. Yeah, it's different. And it only became more specialized.
This is why I think, you can still find a lot of satisfaction in indie games is because with all they enforce limitations that often big studios with their budget don't feel until they have to cut very aggressively. And B, because you can have a few people really shaping a vision.
Well, that's why I'm a bit enthusiastic about AI in the sense that now any designers or actually anybody in the company making a prototype saying, this is why we should have this feature and please play it and see that it actually works in this context and this game. Before that, you had very few people that could do a little bit of everything, have access to the game engine, designing, even, adding the visual effect and so on. It was rare that we had people that could do that.
If you go back, there's always one game that inspired people that got them into the industry that was accessible, right? So I don't like the part where people say, well, it needs to be hard because that's the only way we can find the real talent. That's not it, right? Accessibility is great. BioWare is the greatest example of that because who would give a comic shop book, guy the ability to build some of the greatest franchises in the history of gaming? You wouldn't unless you don't have that choice or the shared experience like Dungeons and Dragons. Ray and Greg taking the chance on every single one of us was really at the root of this.
This is true. I think in that sense, I think Ray and Greg took a chance on all of us, myself included. The choices of people who really and truly probably shouldn't be hired based on just looking at a CV.
No, absolutely not. I mean, I did not finish my university because I eloped to Canada to make video games.
And we are all thankful you did.
Ironically, today, I would probably not get the work permit in Singapore based on education, right? Yet I ended up, Ray and Greg took that chance, right? Which turned into the chance to work on Assassin's Creed and these things. It turns into the chance at working at Facebook based on my previous experience, not based on my education, which I didn't finish because I'm like, hey, I'm going to go make video games. This is more interesting. And so this is also the great risk, like without going again into the AI topic of using AI. AI just, if you use it for hiring, will filter people like us out, every single one of us. The web monkey, the crazy designers. What I will say is, and what I think, when to give like a positive note to all of this, yes, the industry is dying a horrible death right now. Its existing business models no longer work. I see a lot of people out on the street, a lot of people clearly going to churn from this industry with all of their knowledge. What I've learned over the last 10 years is I would hire game people first and foremost. And I did that. Like my teams at Facebook, even the teams for fintech and SaaS and so on, always games people, because we work in frontier technology. We're deeply into done is better than perfect, but also, doing things with what is given to us, right? We're fundamentally conditioned on dealing with change because it's always changing. Tastes are changing. The publisher is changing. Electronic Arts suddenly wants the game to look like Spartacus and splatter plat everywhere. Like the external changes don't faze us. Right? We just we are capable of solving problems on a deadline. And everything we've done 10 years ago in gaming is now highly relevant in the real world. We pioneered analytics. We pioneered figuring out that when a player stands in front of a corridor that looks exactly the same, 80% of people go to the right. We figured out how to instrument, understand the world, read it, and so on. And all of these capabilities only existed in games at the time. You didn't have full observability of the world, but you do today. Cameras, sensors, everything. And so games people are incredibly useful because all the knowledge is 100% transferable, actually. It absolutely is. It's psychology, and AI is really the place. If you have to hire an AI team today, and you have, because none of your people will have the skills, because it's an emergent thing. It's a frontier technology thing. And most importantly, we have always been able to create a product in a non-deterministic environment where the biggest factor, the co-designer, is someone we don't control, whether or not it's an unreliable AI or a human. Our players find a way to turn everything into dick. And I say this as someone, who talk to the sport people and whatnot. They will break everything. They are adversarial. So the mindset you have when you hire a game designer, when you hire a game engineer who's been in that craft for a while, is someone who is deeply comfortable with non-determinism and understands how you have to change your perspective. I see teams in AAA at unicorns, at big tech today, running tests to figure out if they solve things like prompt injection and AI security issues. Not understanding that non-deterministic, meaning the same prompt gives different results, means that testing doesn't work. That you have to switch to observability. You have to look and detect failures rather than trying to test for them to exist, because you can never test all the prompts. So if you have to build a team today, if you have to, get on top of this technology, the best people in the world with that mindset are people from the gaming industry, 5, 6, 10 years of experience in games. That is your prototype AI team that you need right now. That's my impassionate plea here. If anyone actually, is thinking about this, and you probably should, just hire some games people. They're going to figure this out because, they're like, this is all fine. It's all on fire, but that is okay. We can tame even the player we don't know.
On that note, any final words on BioWare for either of you?
When are we doing 2.0?
It would be worth it. Just building something like Neverwinter Night, which gave those tools to create experience. There's really not much like it. So that would be worth doing. What is a small piece of knowledge, small hacks. We keep talking about Neverwinter Night, but having such a flexible engine keep paying dividends. For example, almost the entire story of Dragon Age was playable before we had the new engine, because we implemented it entirely in Neverwinter Night. The writers could play the adventures, we scripted it, and could play the game. And sure, the combat was different and so on, and the graphic were not as nice, but you could validate whether the story was good. And we did the same thing with Old Republic. Before we got the engine online, we prototyped Corriban and other planets, the first chapter of the game in Neverwinter Night. So you could play it and say, story is not working, let's rewrite it, which happened, for example, to the Jedi Knight, which was completely scrapped and rewritten.
I think, there's an incredible strength in doing things that you're not trained to do. Just looking at something and saying, I want to do this. Not being deterred that there is no talent, there is nothing like it in and just doing it. And so there's an incredible strength and courage with that. And I think that creates way more forward momentum than any attempt at manufacturing like a vision for or a mission for millennials and throw all the nonsense, common sense out if you can afford it, if you have, the faith in yourself that you can solve these things and do what you really want to do, then don't let anyone stop you, I think. It does come down, I think, most of it comes down to the root, to the founders. You can't create that. You can find it, but you cannot create that.
I think one of the most amazing places I've ever worked at was BioWare, simply because right down to the person who greeted you at the door, which was Agnes, we were basically all 100% into the vision and mission of BioWare. There wasn't a single person who didn't believe in the idea.
Up to a certain scaling point, yes.
Yeah.
And, the traumatic experience of trying to make these things work, is certainly bonding, right? Creating trust as well, trust in others to be able to do the things that are necessary, stepping up and everything. And unfortunately, I think that is destined to be eroded by scale. And here we are, 23 years later, still meeting every once in a while.
All right. On that note, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks again to my friends Georg Zoller and Emmanuel Lusinki. I've included some photos in the show notes as usual. This week's episode marks the end of this particular series of BioWare stories. I hope you managed to catch all 3 of the episodes. If not, please check the show archives wherever you listen to podcasts. I'll hopefully be interviewing more of my ex-colleagues from BioWare in the future, as I want you to meet as many of the amazing people behind the games along with their stories. I'll be back next week with a fresh episode of Tales Under the Cat Tree. Thank you for listening to another episode of Tales Under the Cat Tree. If you want more original stories and interviews, check out the archives wherever you listen to this podcast. We've covered topics and stories about immigration, artificial intelligence, Stalinist Russia, and otherization, to name but a few. If you have fiction writing you want to feature, or have an interesting story to tell, or know someone who does, please do get in touch with me. This podcast will always be free. Support our work by subscribing and sharing with those who might care. You can reach me through email, contact@dups.ca, bluesky@dups.ca, or on my Substack at tales.dupes.ca. The intro music is composed by me. Give your pet a cuddle and your loved ones a hug till we meet again for some Tales Under the Cat Tree.
Some of these things are PTSD inspiring because everyone worked on all of these things for so long, and then there are these things.